There's a very outstanding article here, an essay in a book called Hegyonei Halacha from Rabbi Yitzchak Mirsky Shlita, and it's called Din Birchas HaTorah, which I'd like to study with you. And if we have time, we'll learn a little bit about Megillas Rus in the light of Isruchan. As far as any mitzvah is concerned, we require a bracha before we perform a mitzvah, and that's called the Birchas HaMitzvah. That is a chiyuv d'Rabbanan. In addition to Birchas HaMitzvah, we have Birchas HaNenin before we eat something. That's also d'Rabbanan. And if you would ask me, is there a mitzvah d'oraisa to make a bracha, I would tell you Birchas HaMazon. And the Torah says, V'achalta v'savata u'berachta. Is there any other bracha that is d'oraisa? And here we get into a major controversy between the Rambam and the Ramban. The Ramban, in his critique on the Sefer HaMitzvos, argues that the Rambam omitted the mitzvah of Birchas HaTorah. And that mitzvah should be counted in Taryag. Shall we assume, perhaps, that the Rambam holds that Birchas HaTorah, the bracha that we recite before we study Torah, like any bracha on a mitzvah, is the Rabbanah. Hence, it should not be counted in the Taryag. Whereas the Ramban holds, and we'll have to see why, that just like Birchas HaMazon is a bracha d'oraisa, and of course it's counted in Taryag, so too Birchas HaTorah is d'oraisa and must be counted in Taryag. Of course, whenever you play the Minyan HaMitzvahs game, if the Rambam omitted one mitzvah and the Ramban added a mitzvah, the Ramban is going to have to juggle it, and he's going to have to somehow subtract another mitzvah to get up to the number 613. Why does the Ramban feel, why is he totally convinced, and he has many proofs we'll see, that Birchas HaTorah, like Birchas HaMazon, is a mitzvah d'oraisa? And this is based on a Gemara in Brachos on Daf Chaf Aleph. The Gemara quotes in the name of Rabbi Yehuda that the pasuk in Parshas Hazinu, Ki Shem Hashem Ekra, Havu Godel Elokeinu, says Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Moshe declared, Kasher Ekra b'Shem Hashem, Tahainu Ekra b'Torah, Havu Godel Elokeinu b'Bracha. And it would seem quite clear and almost explicit from the Gemara in Brachos Chaf Aleph that Rabbi Yehuda, and we don't know if anyone in the dissenting view, would maintain that the bracha on Torah is a bracha d'oraisa. We'll soon see the repercussions. But first and foremost, the Ramban says if you derive it from a pasuk of Ki Shem Hashem Ekra, Havu Godel Elokeinu, then you have to count it in Minyan Taryag. How could it be that the Rambam understood that this mitzvah of being Mavarech, Birchas HaTorah, is only midivrei chachamim, it's only d'Rabbanan, and he omitted it from Taryag when the Gemara says he derived from a pasuk Havu Godel Elokeinu? We have an obligation, a responsibility to recite this bracha. Now, there is a possibility of a middle of the road shita, and it might even be the Rambam shita, that Enochinami, Birchas HaTorah is d'oraisa, and the Ramban is right. That's what comes out of the Gemara. But nevertheless, it's not counted in Taryag. The Rambam, in omitting Birchas HaTorah from the counting of the Minyan Taryag, did not necessarily commit himself to the position that Birchas HaTorah is a rabbinic institution, it's only the Rabbanon. It's quite possible that the Rambam would agree to the Ramban, based on the sugya of Rabbi Yehuda, that Birchas HaTorah is d'oraisa. But he feels that it should not be counted in Taryag. Now, what would be a logical reason to derive a mitzvah, minat Torah, of Birchas HaTorah and not count it in Taryag? I mean, after all, Birchas HaMazon is counted in Taryag. But one of the various rules that govern the issue of whether you count it in Taryag or you do not, as the Rambam formulates it in his Shroshim, the introduction to the Sefer Mitzvah of the Rambam, is that if a mitzvah comes together with another mitzvah as a preliminary, as an accompaniment, then we don't count that as two separate mitzvahs, but rather as a package. And obviously, the mitzvah of Birchas HaTorah is not an independent mitzvah. It doesn't stand on its own 2 feet. It's part of a package. It's an introduction to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, V'shinantam L'vanecha. So when the Rambam counts V'shinantam L'vanecha, the mitzvah and the obligation of studying Torah as one of the minyan Taryag, there is no compelling reason to add Birchas HaTorah as another mitzvah, the minyan Taryag. It's already included. It's encompassed by the mitzvah of Talmud Torah because there is no Birchas HaTorah independent of Talmud Torah. Ki Shem Hashem Ekra. Moshe Rabbeinu says that when you study the Torah, then Havugodol Elokeinu. So the Havugodol Elokeinu is an attachment to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The mitzvah of Talmud Torah comprises 2 different parts: the bracha that comes before the study of Torah and the study of Torah itself. Therefore, says the Rambam, in this possibility, I'm not omitting Birchas HaTorah from the counting of Taryag because I maintain that it's a D'Rabbanan. No. Birchas HaTorah is Doraisa. It's not counted in the minyan Taryag for another reason, a technical reason. It's actually almost by implication, it's included in Taryag. Once I have the mitzvah Talmud Torah, and I cannot study Torah without reciting first the bracha. We'll see which bracha, by the way. Therefore, the bracha itself is part and parcel of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. There's no reason to count it as a separate mitzvah in Taryag. Comes along the Ramban, again to defend his position. And he says, wait a minute, are you telling me that Birchas HaTorah should not be counted in Taryag because it's only an auxiliary mitzvah, it's only a preliminary and a part of a greater mitzvah? Well, what are you going to do with the case of Mikra Bikurim in Parshas Kitavo? And the Torah obligates us not only to bring Bikurim, but to recite an entire chapter in the Torah before we bring the Bikurim. And that means that according to the Rambam's logic, if you don't count Birchas HaTorah as a mitzvah in Taryag, you should not count Mikra Bikurim as a mitzvah in Taryag. And furthermore, argues the Ramban, Rabbi Gamliel in the famous Mishnah at the end of the Masechet Pesachim says that when you bring the Korban Pesach, you're required to recite Pesach Zeh Al Shem Ma, and the Rambam himself admits and codifies the Al Shem Ma, that recitation, as a separate mitzvah Taryag of Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. So why is it that Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, as an accompaniment to the Korban Pesach, is nevertheless counted as a separate independent mitzvah Taryag, and Birchas HaTorah, which is a mitzvah derived from the Torah, Ki Shem Hashem Ekra, is not counted in the minyan Taryag? And once again, the ball is now in, proverbially, the Rambam's court. Why would the Rambam count Mikra Bikurim as an independent mitzvah in addition to Havas HaBikurim, where you place the Bikurim on top of the Mizbeach, and Zecha Yitzias Mitzrayim as a separate mitzvah in addition to the Korban Pesach, and yet Birchas HaTorah does not deserve to be counted as an independent mitzvah? The Ramban has another very strong argument to prove that the mitzvah of Birchas HaTorah deserves to be counted in Taryag. And he quotes a Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi quote says, Minayin leBirchas HaTorah min HaTorah. And you can't be more explicit than that. The Gemara assumes that Birchas HaTorah is min HaTorah. And the Yerushalmi asks Minayin. Where do we find it? Kishem Hashem Ekra, but min HaTorah. You see that Birchas HaTorah is clearly a mitzvah d'oraisa. That particular proof of the Ramban is not convincing. As the Netziv Mivaloshin points out, that language of Minayin X min HaTorah appears over and over again throughout Shabbos. And it doesn't mean that we're dealing with a mitzvah d'oraisa. The language Minayin min HaTorah is a language that the Rabbanon utilized to indicate that there is an asmachta in the Torah for a mitzvah d'Rabbanon. And then Netziv proves this from the case of Esther min HaTorah Minayin. Now we know that Megillas Esther is a d'Rabbanon. Nobody argues that it's a d'oraisa. The Bahag might count it in Taryag for a whole nother reason, but on the level of a d'oraisa, we cannot subsume Mikra Megillah as d'oraisa, yet the Gemara says, Minayin le'Esther min HaTorah. And the Gemara finds an asmachta in the Torah itself for Megillas Esther. I would add a footnote of my own here. The Gemara at the end of Kiddushin writes, Minayin le'iser yichud min HaTorah. And the Gemara comes up with some way out asmachta, a drasha that you'd have to spend a half hour trying to rack your brains and figure it out. In the Parsha Mesis, Yesischa, I won't go into the whole, you'll take a look on Pe'alim. But clearly, according to the Rambam and many Rishonim, the Isa Yichud is only the Rabbanon. And yet the Gemara uses the language, Minayin le'Isa Yichud min HaTorah. So the fact that the Yerushalmi utilizes the same lingo of Minayin leBirchas HaTorah min HaTorah, that doesn't necessarily prove that the Yerushalmi held that the mitzvah of Birchas HaTorah is d'oraisa. However, the plot grows thicker because Yerushalmi assumes an equation, get this, between Birchas HaTorah and Birchas HaMazon. In fact, Yerushalmi takes this analogy very, very far. Yerushalmi wants to understand why is it that with regard to Birchas HaMazon, the Torah requires of us to recite that bracha after we hit satiation. V'achalta, v'savata, and then uverachta. A bracha before we eat is only d'Rabbanan. But on a Torah level, we recite the bracha Birchas HaMazon clearly, explicitly after we finish and we reach the state of severe satisfaction. In the case of Birchas HaTorah, asks the Yerushalmi, we should derive that Birchas HaTorah, like Birchas HaMazon, should come as the finale following the Torah that we studied. And just like this physical satiation, there is spiritual satiation, and that's what we have to make a bracha. And unbelievable, Yerushalmi calls it a kal vachomer. If the Torah requires of us to recite a bracha after we're physically satiated, how much more so when we're spiritually and intellectually satiated by the Torah we studied? And Yerushalmi comes up with a very fascinating answer to distinguish between the two. When a person is hungry, he's not in the mood to make a bracha and express his gratitude to God, anticipating that he will eat a meal. He's now hungry. After he finishes and he's satiated, now he's in the mood, he's in the mental, psychological state that's appropriate to make a bracha and thank Hashem. In the case of Torah, Torah is not a physical pleasure. Torah is a spiritual pleasure. It's an intellectual pleasure. And therefore, a person can already anticipate, before he embarks upon studying Torah, the pleasure of studying Torah. And therefore, he can recite the bracha before him. But you see clearly that the Yerushalmi was operating with an analogy, an equation between Birchas HaMazon and Birchas HaTorah under the assumption they are both Dorais. And that is a very, very strong proof. Such a strong proof that the super commentary on the Sefer HaMitzvahs, which is called the Megillas Esther, that was written many centuries ago by one of the great Sephardic rabbis, Bilion was his name, he writes that the Ramban is right in his accusation and his claim against the Rambam. Why did you omit Birchas HaTorah? I don't know, Rabotzai, if you appreciate this. The Megillas Esther, I would venture in 99 out of 100 cases will defend the Rambam against the Ramban. And he will protect his Rebbe, the Rambam, against the onslaught of the Ramban. This is one of the few exceptions, the rare cases in which the Megillas Esther himself takes the Rambam to task. Why did you omit Birchas HaTorah from your account of Taryag Mitzvahs? The Ramban and many others after the Ramban quote an Agadita, a very famous statement in the Gemara, in the Dorim on Daf Pei Aleph. The Gemara asks on the pasuk that indicates the exile of the Jewish people, Mipnei Ma of the Aretz. Why did we lose the land of Israel? And the Gemara says, Al Shalo Berchu Tchila. They were guilty of not reciting Birchas HaTorah. Again, you might have 10 different interpretations of what the Gemara means. Why should we lose our land and go into exile? Because we omitted the Birchas HaTorah. But to say that Birchas HaTorah is only D'Rabbanan, and as a result of ignoring this mitzvah, we go out to exile, that doesn't make any sense. At least if it were Dorais, as the Rabban would say, we can appreciate that there's a punishment. We don't know exactly why the punishment is so severe, but nevertheless, we're dealing with the Dorais. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the Ramban brings two cases in which we have a recitation which we're obligated to recite as an accompaniment to a Maisa mitzvah, and we count both as separate mitzvahs in Taryag. And those are Mikra Bikurim and Zecher Lietzias Mitzrayim, or Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now, if you're following the text, I have to thank two people in this case. My good buddy Chaim Besson, who sent it over to David Spiegel, if you have it in front of you. So check your email to make sure you have it. Here is a brilliant insight of Rabbi Yerucham Fischel Perlau, who is officially the super commentary on the Sefer HaMitzvahs of Rav Saadia Gaon. And he says the following. He says, we cannot compare, it's really unfair to make an analogy between Mikra Bikurim and its relation to Bikurim, in which case we count it as two separate mitzvahs, and Birchas HaTorah and its relation to Talmud Torah as two separate mitzvahs in the Ramban's argument. We have in the Mishnayos in Masechta Bikurim a large, long number of cases which fit the following description: Mevi v'eno koreh. For example, a ger cannot recite Mikra Bikurim. Ha'aretz asher nasata l'avosenu, he cannot recite that. But nevertheless, he's obligated, like you and I, in the mitzvah of Havas HaBikurim. But you see clearly that the mitzvah of Mikra Bikurim stands independent of havas bikurim. We could have havas bikurim without mikra bikurim. But you would never have a mitzvah of Talmud Torah without the brachos. Talmud Torah and its brachos are inextricably bound together and cannot be separated one from the other. Then he goes on to say that the same logic should apply to Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. In fact, today, B'zman Hazeh, we don't have the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, yet we still remain with the mitzvah, the obligation of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. Obviously, I derive the conclusion that Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim is independent of the mitzvah Achilas HaPesach. But in the case of Talmud Torah, as we emphasized before, if you're fulfilling the mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah, of Talmud Torah, then by definition you require the recitation of Birchas. Now, at this point, Rabbosai, if you will allow me, I would add my own footnote here. The Ramban, Lishitaso, is absolutely correct. I'll tell you why. There's no such thing as mikra bikurim without havas habikurim. There ain't no such mitzvah. You bring bikurim and you're obligated in mikra bikurim if you have all the credentials and all the conditions. So that mikra bikurim could never be independent of havas bikurim, and yet they counted as two separate mitzvahs. The Ramban L'Shitaso was absolutely convinced that Birchas HaTorah will always accompany Talmud Torah, and there's no Talmud Torah without Birchas HaTorah. And therefore, Mikra Bikurim is a wonderful model from which I could derive a principle in Sefer HaMitzvahs, in Minyan HaMitzvahs, that you could have two mitzvahs. The first could never exist without the second, and yet the first is counted independently. You have two obligations. Again, they come together. For example, you might argue that every day of Sfiras HaOmer requires a separate bracha. Hence, every day of Sfiras HaOmer is a separate mitzvah, and yet it would be meaningless to count the first day of the Omer without counting the next 48 days of the Omer. So you can have two mitzvahs that are interdependent, and one could not exist without the other, and yet they are separate mitzvahs. They each require its own bracha. Of course, you could always argue, would anyone entertain that we should count 49 mitzvahs in Taryag based on the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer? But I would add the following. The Ramban could go a step further. I'm trying to figure out if somebody is trying to speak here. You know, when I see just, I don't know. I have a feeling we're getting some interference. I'm going to make one more effort to press this technological button and see if it works. No, it's not working. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So if there's anyone out there who can help me by pressing the mute button. Okay, great. Again, I'm not asking the one who is guilty to stand up and leave. That's the case of Rebbe with the garlic. But be that as it may, I was thinking that the Ramban, in his argument against the Rambam, might even go one step further and argue that Birchas HaTorah could exist independent of Talmud Torah. What do I mean? Supposing I cannot learn Torah for whatever reason. I don't have the wherewithal, I don't have the knowledge, and I'm stuck somewhere on the moon. The Ramban might argue that I still am obligated the mitzvah of Birchas HaTorah. Again, all this will depend upon our next discussion, which we're coming to in a minute, as to which of three brachos, according to the Ramban Shita, are d'oraisa. But here, I want to take a very important pause. By the way, Joe, why did you move from this side to this side? In any event. So again, just to summarize, we have three possible shitos. We have one shita, the Ramban, Birchas HaTorah's d'oraisa should be counted in Taryag. We have the other polar extreme that maybe the Rambam omits Birchas HaTorah from his counting of Taryag because he holds it's the Rabbana like all other brachos. And then we have a middle shita that maybe the Rambam did not ignore and downgrade the status of Birchas HaTorah. Havu Gadol Elokeinu is d'oraisa, but he doesn't want to count it in Taryag because the Rambam's opinion against the Ramban is that it's an add-on, it's a tag-on, it's auxiliary to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and it never exists on its own. Wonderful. Summary of everything we've discussed. Is there enough gemina? Or is this whole discussion purely conceptual and theoretical? And what's the answer? If you saw page 124. So, what do I do in a case of suffering? Where is my friend, the rabbi from Clinton Park? Sabal, right? Safek brachas lahakil, says Rabbi Yeshua, all the time. But that's only because the mitzvah of bracha is a mitzvah d'Rabbana. But I'll prove to you that in the case of a safek bracha d'oraisa, you're obligated mitzad safek to recite the bracha. And Rabbi Weber spoke about this many times, if you remember, the good old days. And he said that in Birkas HaMazon, if you have a doubt whether you recited Birkas HaMazon, and that kind of doubt becomes more relevant the older you get, then you're going to have to recite Birkas HaMazon again, because Safek d'oraisa l'chumra. And the same thing will apply according to the Ramban in Birchas HaTorah. If I have my doubts as to whether or not I recited Birchas HaTorah, I'll be obligated to do so mitzad Safek. We will suspend the rule of Safek brachas lahakel because we're dealing with a d'oraisa. Masha'ein, according to the Rambam, if we take the other extreme sheet in the Rambam, and the Rambam nowhere indicates that Birchas HaTorah is d'oraisa, then I assume Safek brachas lahakel will apply to Birchas HaTorah as it applies to every other bracha minus Birchas HaMazon. Now, which of the brachos, according to the Ramban, would I have to recite in a case of safek? And ostensibly, we have three brachos: Lasok b'divrei Torah, or the Sfaradim say Al divrei Torah. We have Harevnu Hashem Elokeinu, which ends with the bracha Baruch Atah Hashem Amalani Torah Li'am Yisrael. And it depends whether that's a separate bracha. The girsa is Veharevnu. If you add a vav, then it could be Varevna is just an extension of the first bracha. I don't know. And then we have the clincher, and here we find another machlokas. We have a flow chart. So you have the machlokas in the Rambam and the Ramban about whether or not Birchas HaTorah is d'oraisa. And then within the Ramban Shita, assuming that Birchas HaTorah is d'oraisa, which one of these brachos is min HaTorah? And again, the nafkamina is going to be in a case of safek, which one do I have to recite? And according to one opinion, it's the bracha of lasok b'divrei Torah. And the reason for that is simple. Lasok b'divrei Torah is a birchas ha-mitzvah. And if Rabbi Yehuda in Masechta Brachas derives from a pasuk in Chumash that this birchas ha-mitzvah, this bracha on a mitzvah, is different than every other bracha, and it requires on a d'oraisa level that I recite the bracha before the mitzvah, and it makes sense that lasok b'divrei Torah is the one. That's the one that's d'oraisa. However, the Bach and others, they're of the opinion that Lasok b'divrei Torah is a bracha that we borrow from Birchas HaMitzvah in general. It's just another example of the Birchas HaMitzvah, and that's not what the Ramban had in mind when he came to the conclusion that Birchas HaTorah is Dorais. Says the Bach, the Dorais of Havu Godel is an emphasis on Gedula, on gratitude, on appreciating the Torah as the greatest gift that we have, that defines the very essence of Klal Yisrael as a separate nation, as a unique Goy, Kadosh, it's the Torah. This is the obligation of Havu Godel Elokeinu, and reciting Asher Bachar Banu we call Amin V'Nosal Torah. So that's the bracha that the Ramban would require on a Doraisa level. As far as the mitzvah is concerned, yes, Talmud Torah requires a mitzvah, like any mitzvah. Like if I was making a bracha on tzitzis, on hadlakas neiros, whatever mitzvah you want, we require Asher Kinshanu Mitzvah. So Talmud Torah is no different. That bracha, the first bracha, and perhaps the second bracha as an extension of the first bracha, is the Rabbanon, even according to the Ramban. But the last bracha, Asher Bachar Banu, that is a bracha d'oraisa, an obligation derived from the pasuk Avu Godel Elokeinu. And here we have a fascinating analogy to the case of tefillin. Now, what I'm about to present to you is Shitas HaTosfos in the brachos on tefillin. I add that as an introduction because in my family, we have a different tradition. We never accepted the Shitas HaTosfos. Based on the Arizal, we have a different Shita, which is very similar to the Sfaradim, and that is that there's only one bracha on tefillin. And that bracha covers me for both tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel rosh. But the Balei HaTosfos have two brachas on tefillin. One is Lo'aniach, and the other is Al Mitzvahs tefillin. The first on tefillin shel yad, and the second on tefillin shel rosh. And Tosfos takes this very far. He says that tefillin shel rosh, listen to this, my friend, requires two brachas. Two brachas. Did you ever hear such a thing? And Tosfos goes on to say that the bracha of La'aniach, the first of the two, is on the shel rosh. And the second bracha, Al Mitzvahs tefillin, is the second bracha on the shel rosh. And Tosfos therefore paskins that if he was mafsik and he interrupted between the tefillin shel yad and the tefillin shel rosh, he will recite two brachas on the shel rosh, La'aniach and Al Mitzvahs tefillin. What's this all about? We never found that a mitzvah deserves two brachas. Unless the mitzvah indicates a separate kiyum beyond the ma'aseh mitzvah. Every mitzvah has its ma'aseh mitzvah. You makayim the mitzvah when you do the ma'aseh mitzvah. But what we find in a rare few cases is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu establishes a covenant, a bris, through a mitzvah. Like, for example, bris milah. And bris milah will require two brachas, one on the ma'aseh mitzvah and the other on the bris. So we'll have a bracha of Asher Kinshanu Mitzvah Tzivara Mitzvah Milah, and then we'll have another bracha, which is recited classically by the father of the son, Lachniso B'Briso Shel Avraham Avinu, because the entity of bris milah has two distinct dimensions to it. Each one is a separate kiyum and generates its own bracha. So too, in tefillin shel rosh, where the gavra, the person, is me'utar b'tefillin. In fact, the sheet of the Rosh, funny, the Rosh on the Tefillin Shel Rosh, is that the bracha that we say every morning, Oter Yisrael B'Sifara, should be recited right before you put on the Tefillin Shel Rosh. That's not our minute. But the reason for that is that there's a concept called Oter B'Tefillin, and that specifically relates to Tefillin Shel Rosh. And that's why the Gemara says, V'ro kalami aretz ki shem Hashem nikra olecha elu tefillin shel Rosh. Talmud Torah also has an extra element and an extra key. The great bris of Torah, the covenant that was established between Klal Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the Torah. And every time I study the Torah, I am re-experiencing that bris. I am elevating myself. That's why there are many special dinim that apply to someone who's learning Torah. If somebody goes by, he's not allowed to interrupt, he's not allowed to interfere. And the 4 amos around someone who's learning Torah are prohibited from certain activities like Beis HaMerchatz and any sort of nakedness. And that's why the halacha requires that when you come in contact with someone who is studying Torah, you have to have a special awe and respect for that person. The Rambam codifies it in the 3rd parak of Talmud Torah, and he calls it Muchtar B'Keser Torah. He's wearing the crown of Torah. The crown of Torah indicates that he has completely transformed his personality. And the Mishnah in the 6th parak of Avos describes that change in personality. He's called Yedid, and he's called Oeves HaMokom and Oeves HaBrios. All this is a result of the impact of Torah on the person. And therefore, just like in Tefillin Shel Rosh, where we have 2 brachos, according to Shitas HaTosfos, so too we will have in Birchas HaTorah a bracha on a Lamed Torah L'Am Yisrael, which is a bracha on Limud Torah L'Shma, and Limud Torah L'Shma, as the Bach says, will elevate us to a status of Shechina. The Shechina is now shor on us. The Gemara, the Mishnah in Avos says even one person who's learning alone, not just 10, and it goes down and down and down. One person learning alone, the Shechina is there. Torah brings the Shechina. And in that context, we require Torah L'Shma. And then, Asher Bachar Banu, we have a bris relationship as a nation of Goy Kadosh with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is cemented by Talmud Torah. And that extra dimension of Talmud Torah requires and generates its own bracha, Asher Bachar Banu. And the Ramban, therefore, would argue that that separate kiyum, which goes way beyond the mitzvah itself, like any other mitzvah, and is unique to Talmud Torah, requires of us a bracha d'oraisa havgodel Elokeinu. And the language of the Bach is very, very impressive, which you'll see on the top of page 126. Shenitz tavenu lahodos l'shmo yisbarach b'chol eis shenikra b'torah ala tova gdola she'asa lanu b'seiso toraseinu eleinu. And it means that this bracha in which we thank Hashem for choosing us and granting us the great gift of the Torah is a mitzvah aseh d'oraisa. And that's why, as I mentioned before, I believe that the Ramban might argue that even if a person was, we gave an example, he's on the moon, he has no sfarim on the moon, he can't even get access to the internet on the moon, there's just no internet access on the moon at this point. And therefore he cannot look up HebrewBooks.org or any of the other great sites if you want to find sfarim. He's lost. He will still make the bracha thanking Hashem for this great gift of giving us the Torah. Lasof b'divrei Torah is a bracha on the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. But Asher Bachar Banu is not for the kiyum mitzvah of Talmud Torah, but rather for this kadshus, the sanctification, the bris relationship that is achieved and effectuated by the study of Torah. not on the Maisa Limud like any other Maisa Mitzvah. It's an additional bracha asher bochar banu. And Mashal Amad Dom, an interesting analogy. Misha Ochel Pri, Umevareth Birchas HaNenim. What is he thanking Hashem for? Is he thanking Hashem for the achila of the pri? Borei pri ha'etz. He doesn't say, shed nosan lanu achilas ha'pri. But he's thanking Hashem for the pri itself. In essence, he's thanking Hashem for creation. Birchas asher bochar banu. Torah atzma, on the Torah itself. There's a bracha on the Maisa Mitzvah, the intellectual endeavor of studying Torah, and there's a bracha on the Torah itself. And perhaps that would explain why women would make a bracha on Talmud Torah. If you're an Ashkenazia, then Rabbeinu Tam says that a woman makes a bracha on any mitzvah that she opts for voluntarily, like shofar and lulav and sukkah, etc. But if you're the Beis Yosef, based on the Rambam, a woman does not make a bracha if she's not obligated. And in the case of Talmud Torah, we have a very famous Gemara in Kiddushin, darshaning the word v'shinantam live on necha b'necha b'nosecha. Women are exempt from Talmud Torah. Why does the same Shulchan Aruch, who absolutely opposes a woman reciting a bracha on a voluntary mitzvah say, yet he codifies the halacha in Orach Chaim Siman Lamed Zayin that a woman makes a bracha on Birchas HaTorah? And the answer is because the bracha is on the Torah itself. And a woman, no less than a man, has the Torah. Doesn't mean that she can be present in the shul. I don't know. But as far as having the Torah is concerned, she has the Torah. And therefore, she can make a bracha on Talmud Torah. And the Bach adds an unbelievable piece. Why is it that the omission of the bracha is so severe that we go out into goals, the Gemara that we mentioned earlier in the Durham Pei Aleph? Why such a severe punishment? The answer is that there's a very profound analogy between the mitzvah of Talmud Torah and the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael. In both cases, the goal of the mitzvah is his kadshus, is to sanctify the person and bring the person into a close rendezvous relationship with the Shekhinah. And although the people of Israel, before the exile, they certainly studied Torah, but they left out the bracha. And the bracha of Asher Bochar Banu, as we said earlier, is on the close relationship between the student of Torah when he studies Torah and the Shekhinah. And if he omits that bracha, he's basically reducing his Talmud Torah to a mitzvah like any other mitzvah. And he's missing the point. What is unique about Talmud Torah? What added dimension is there to the kiyum of Talmud Torah? It is uplifting the person and bringing him close to the Shekhinah. That's what Eretz Yisrael is all about. Does a person to whom Shekhinah is insignificant to the extent that he omits the bracha on Talmud Torah, does that person deserve Eretz Yisrael? This is the essence of Eretz Yisrael, to come closer to the Shekhinah. And from that perspective, there is a very, very profound similarity or analogy, if you will, between the mitzvah of Talmud Torah and its bracha, doraisa, and the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. There was a piece here from the Aruch HaShulchan. I'm just trying to remember. Okay. The Aruch HaShulchan also seconds the motion of the double bracha on Tefillin Shel Rosh that we spoke about earlier. Now, Rabbosai, this essay that we just studied is about 7 pages long. I really prepared to discuss with you another essay in the same book about Megillas Rus. And number one, why we read the Megillah on Shavuos. And I think it's a very important message as we go into the post-Shavuos period of time, the balance of the month of Sivan. However, I didn't get a chance to photocopy all these pages and photograph them. And at this point, I'm going to give it to you Baal Peh, which is not so terrible. After all, we are studying Torah Baal Peh. And we have approximately 15 minutes in which I would try to highlight this essay. And if you get a chance, I was wondering if they have the Sefer on the shelves in Clanton Park. It's called Pegyonei Halacha. See if you can get access to it, and then open up to pages 134 to 140, another 7 pages. And we begin with a statement of the Medrash. What is it about Megillas Rus that makes it so unique? After all, the Medrash asks in the name of Rav Zeira, Megillah zu ein ba lo limud halachos, lo tuma, lo tara, lo isa, lo hender. So what is it all about? Why is it part of the 24 holy books of Kisvei HaKodesh? And the answer is, says the Medrash, that there's one thing about this Megillah that makes it absolutely critical for every Jew to understand. And this has to do with the yichus of David HaMelech. There was a tremendous division about the issue of Moaviah, whether or not Boaz was permitted to marry Rus. The Torah says, Lo yovo Ammoni Moavi b'kal Hashem. And that's a pasuk in Parshas Iteitzeh. And the question is, can we be Makabel Gerim when the Torah says, Lo yovo b'kal Hashem? Unless we assume that the Torah is referring specifically to the male members of Moab, but not the female members. And back in the day, there was a tremendous machlokas about this issue. And the Gemara in Masechta Yevamos records the entire machlokas. It starts with the moment that David volunteers to destroy Goliath. And the pasuk in Shmuel describes Avner, who is the Sar Tzava, asking, Ben mi zeh hanar? Tell me a little bit about the lineage of this young man. And the Gemara says that Shaul HaMelech did not give him an answer, and he got the answer later on from Doeg. We'll see about that soon. So the Gemara asks in Bava Basra, why didn't Shaul know the answer to that question? Already in an earlier pasuk, it says, Vayaveu mi'od. Shaul had a tremendous love initially for David HaMelech. Vayilo nenosei kelim. So the Gemara says that the question that was being asked here, Shaul and Avner, was about the yichus of David. It doesn't say in the pasuk ben mi zehanar, right? It doesn't say mi zehanar. It says ben mi zehanar. And the question was about the lineage. Once again, the Gemara asked, what do you mean? They didn't know that David HaMelech was the son, David was the son of Yishai? Yishai was one of the Sarei HaMelech in the king's court. And the Gemara answers that Shaul began to sense that he was losing his grip on the Malchus in the aftermath of the fiasco with Agag and so forth. And now David HaMelech, little David, is going out there, which what's called the Taksise Malchus, like as if he's, the leader of, he's the only one who's willing to face Goliath. And Shaul began to be afraid, wait a minute, maybe this is the person who is going to rob me of my Malchus, as Shmuel Hanavi had already predicted. So when he asked Ben Mizeh Hanar, he wasn't asking about Yishai, the father of David. He was asking about the mishpacha of David. Is David HaMelech from Zera Malchus? Now, David HaMelech and his family came from Shevet Yehuda, but Yehuda was subdivided into Peretz and Zorach. Peretz was earmarked for Malchus, Zerach for other very important tasks, but not for Malchus. And again, the Gemara goes into a whole discussion here how we know that Peretz was the one who was chosen for Malchus. But in any event, from which mishpacha of Shevet Yehuda is David coming from? Now Doeg stands up. Doeg is one of the heads of the Sanhedrin. And he says to Avner, to Shaul, he says, why are you asking about David, whether he's from Peretz or from Zorach? Why don't you ask whether he is a member of Klal Yisrael, whether we can allow him to marry into the Jewish family? He is a descendant of Rus HaMoaviyah. Now, at this point, Avner responds, and he says that we have halacha of Moavi v'lo Moaviyah. So therefore, the Torah only prohibited the male members of Moab. So Doeg says to him, wait a minute. It says Lo Yovo Mamzer b'Kalshim. You can tell me that we're allowed to marry a Mamzeres? In other words, the Torah says you're not allowed to marry a Mitzri. So what you can tell me but you're allowed to marry a Mitzris? The Torah uses the language of masculine, but it refers to the entire nation, whether it's the Mitzrim, whether it's the Moavim, the Yamonim. So Avner gets up and he says, wait a minute, this is not a fair analogy. Why? Because in the cases of Mamzeres, Mitzris, Ammonis, and the like, the Torah says, Lo Yova B'Kal Hashem. But in the case of Moab, the Torah gives the reason for excluding them from Kal Hashem. Al Shalo Kidmu Eschem Belechem Uvamayim. When you came up from Mitzrayim and you were very hungry and thirsty, they didn't give you Lechem Umayim. Says Avner, Mi Chayav Lekadei Belechem Umayim Hascharim. It's an obligation on the males. The females are Pnima, they're modest. Therefore, the Torah excluded the Zecharim, but not the Nekevos. And Doeg comes forward and again argues against Avner. And he says the following. Even though the Torah says, Asher lo tidnu eschem belechem v'mayim, there's another very compelling reason why we should exclude the women. And that is the men should have brought out water and bread to the men of Israel, the Israelites, and the women to the women Israelites. And at this point, the Gemara reports that Avner fell silent. Nishtatek, he had nothing to answer to Doeg. At that moment in time, David was declared apostle. And Shaul turns to Doeg, and Shaul asks him, Ben mizeh ha'elem. Now, until now, Shaul had called David a nar. Now he calls him Elem, Ayin Lamed Mem. And the Gemara says that now Shaul made an allusion, a remez to Doeg with the word Elem, which means Helen, that we really don't have a clear answer. It's Nelam, we don't really know. And the implication, says the Gemara, was that Shaul was telling Doeg to go back to the Beis Medrash and ask the question about Moaviyah, David's lineage. Once again, in the Beis Medrash, they gave them the same argument as Avner had put forward. And Doeg asked his question: why shouldn't the women folk of Moab be guilty of not being Mekayim Noshen? Doeg's argument in the Beis Medrash was very compelling, and at that point, they were about to make a hachrazah, a public announcement that David HaMelech is not allowed into Kal Hashem. He's what we call Psul Yuchsin. Until a fellow by the name of Amsa ben Yeser stands up and he puts on, I don't want to mention his name, the Rosh Marusha. He's already dead, Baruch Hashem, although I don't know that he, who took over is any better than him. But anyway, I'm talking about, who showed up in the United Nations, Anyway, so that Amsha says, here's my cherev. He pulls out a sword and he says, call me she'eno shomea halacha zu yidaker b'cherev. Kach mekublani mibeis dino shel Shmuel Aramasi Ammoni v'lo Ammonis Moavi v'lo Moavis. The whole thing makes no sense. It seems that they were about to accept the argument of Doeg, that just like a mamzer includes mamzeres in the Yisr, and just like the Psul of Yuchsin and Mitzri and so forth includes Mitzris, so too they were going to apostle David. So again, this big, sword waving carrier, by the name of Amsa gets up and he threatens them. Well, what's it all about? Now, another question, and then we'll get to the answer that answers all these questions in Mirza Hashem, is the question about Ploni Almoni. Rashi says that when Ploni Almoni declares, I'm not going to marry Rus, pen ashris es nachlasi, Rashi says nachlasi doesn't refer to the nachla, but rather to bonim. Rashi quotes the pasuk, nachlas Hashem bonim. And Rashi tells us that this Ploni Almoni was of the opinion that Rus, as a Moaviyah, was not allowed to be incorporated into Klal Yisrael. And therefore, if he would marry her, his children would be psulim. But the question is, why is it that Ploni Almoni is worried about his children? He's not allowed to marry Rus. L'shitaso, the Torah has excluded marrying a Moaviyah. Why is he worried about his zera? And all these questions are answered by the Brisker Rav. He says the following. And if you want to get just the flavor of it, you'll open up to this sefer if you get a hold of it, page 136. And this is where we're going to wrap it up in Mirza Hashem for today. Says the Brisker Rav, you want to know what the chiddush of Amsa was? I'll tell you what it is. Listen to Amsa's language. The Gemara says that Amsa declares, Kach mekublani mi beis dino shel Shmuel. Moavi v'lo Moavis. Why is that a final decision, a hachra on this contention regarding a Moavis. Says the Brisker Rav, within the context of Horah, we have two different branches or categories of Horah. One is Horah's din, which means that we have midos, shator, and nidreshes mehem. We have various methods and rules by which we analyze the Torah. We try to understand the Torah and derive halachas. And finally, we come to a decision, and there are many different rules and regulations, Rabbin v'Yachid, and so forth and so on, in terms of Horah. But then there's another category of Horah, an entirely different category, and that's called Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Says the Brisker Rav, what's the difference between the two Halacha l'Maisa? It's a tremendous difference. Says the Brisker Rav, when you derive a halachic ruling from the midos shator nidreshes bahem, then we have a halacha that a future bezdin down the line, if it's gadol mimenu bechachma u'b'minyan, can overrule the earlier decision of a bezdin. Masha ein kain in conscious when it comes to halacha l'Moshe Sinai, no one could argue against halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There can never be contention regarding halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The Goem, and apparently Doeg as well, were of the opinion that the halacha of Ammoni v'lo Ammonis or Moavi v'lo Moavis is all based on midos shator nidreshes. So we take a look, we try to figure out why the Torah excludes Moav, and one understanding is it only applies to the men, and Doeg said no, the women should also be excluded. And the Ploni Almoni was afraid that within the context of Horah's din, at some point in the future, he could rely on the ultimate ruling of Amsa quoting Shmuel HaNavi. Yes, that would be okay for him. But what would happen if 100 years down the line, some bezdin that's greater than this bezdin would overrule the original decision and decide that, the logic of Doeg is compelling, and we have to exclude from Kol even a Moavi, a Moaviyah, and she is Psulei Kol. Then his children, Namafreya, all become Psulim. That's why Pen Ashkis Es Nachlos. And from this perspective of the Brisker Rav, the Ploni Almoni was not such a bad guy. He had his reasoning. He was under that impression. Here's where Amsa comes to the forefront. And he says, Mekublani mi bezdin chel Shmuel. Says the Brisker Rav, you know what that means? It means that this halacha of Moavi v'lo Moaviyah is a Kabbalah l'Moshe Sinai. Again, the language is that kach mekublani, but mekublani means that this Kabbalah is an unbroken chain that goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. Is therefore, says the Brisker Rav, Eina asuyo libatel olamis. A halacha misinai can never be batel. No bezdin, no matter how great they are, can overrule halacha Moshe Sinai. And that's what Amso was testifying, Kach Mekublani, that this is halacha Moshe Sinai, which is omedes li olam. And now we understand why it's so critical to read Megillas Rus, David HaMelech, and ultimately Mashiach come from this Megillah, because on a halachic level, legally, the entire basis for accepting David HaMelech is this Megillah. And what happens is that, as you remember, Boaz, after Ploni Almoni drops out, he gathers together Asoras Canaan. And the Asoras Canaan again certify that this halacha, that Moavi v'lo Moavis, is halacha Moshe Sinai. Boaz, you have nothing to worry about. And the Ploni Almoni was the one who was mistakenly under the impression that it's Midos, Shator Nidreshes for him, and that down the line there might be a change in a greater basis that overrules the earlier basis. This is half of the essay here. For those of you, if I've succeeded in whetting your appetite a little bit, you might want to read and study the second half of this essay about Megillas Rus. Fascinating things that are absolutely exciting. Again, you're going to have to make Birchas HaTorah, though, before you do so. So let me take this opportunity to thank you, as always, and to wish you a great Isru Chag. Here we're already Isru Chag, but we're not saying Tehillim. I mean Tachlim. So we're still in the post-Shavuos mental state, and we should be Zochem Mirz Hashem to learn lots and lots of Torah together. Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rav. Have a good day. Thank you, Kelton.